This message comes to you from King's Church Wirral, UK. We hope that as you listen, you will be encouraged, blessed and inspired. Well, over the last few months, we've been looking at the book of John, and over the last few weeks, specifically looking at the signs, the miracles of Jesus in the book of John. Now, John, as we've come to learn, has been very intentional about the structure of his gospel and what is included from the life of Jesus. So we know Jesus did many miracles. You know, we can read that throughout the four Gospels, that he did many miracles. But John only includes 7 miracles in his Gospel. And I think every week we've looked at the purpose for what John wrote. And that being, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So as we look at our next sign today, remember that the reason John is writing is to cause a response in you. A response to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing this truth, you will have life. Life in all its fullness. So in John 9, we are going to read the account of Jesus healing a man born blind. So just to give you a bit of context really to where we are up to before this sign happens. Jesus has just been at the Feast of Tabernacles. This was an 8-day celebration. It's great, isn't it? 8 days of celebrating God's leading, his provision, his protection when the Israelites lived in the wilderness. He's just been teaching the people that he is the light of the world. He has continued speaking, and the Jewish leaders are becoming enraged. They're not liking what he is proclaiming. And so they've picked up stones ready to stone him to death. And Jesus manages to hide away, slip into the crowd, and gets away from that situation. And it's as he's walking away from the temple, as he's walking away from being stoned to death, he comes across a man born blind. So if you have got your Bibles, going to put it up on the screen. It's a bit of a chunk that we're going to read today, but I think it's good to read it all in its context. So John 9 verse 1. As he went along, Jesus being, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, No, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened, they asked. He replied, The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed. Then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, How can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, He is a prophet. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know that he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. What an amazing account. And also, I'm always shocked by the response that someone gets healed and the response is so divided. You would think someone was healed and it would be like, amazing. But it was such a divided crowd, obviously because of so much history going back and understanding to that. So to begin with, we get an insight into the belief and understanding of what the disciples and the Pharisees believed of someone who had a sickness or an illness by the question they ask and the statement they make. The disciples asked, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And later on, the Pharisees in response say, you were steeped in sin at birth. And this same understanding can be read about in the book of Job. Job was a wealthy, upright man who lost his possessions, his children, and his health. Job did not understand why he was suffering. His friends assumed that he was suffering because of sin in his life. They tried to persuade Job on many times, repent of your sin. But the three friends, we find out, were wrong in their assumptions. Job's friends, the disciples, the Pharisees, they all express this legitimate question: who sinned? Is this person's suffering a result of their own sin? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Suffering is not always a result of personal sin, a direct result of personal sin. Those who follow God are not exempt from trouble. We're not exempt from trouble or persecution. Although we may not be able to understand fully the pain we experience, but it can lead us to rediscover God. In the book of Job, after Job's friends have tried to give their wisdom and their own understanding about the situation of what Job should do, God speaks. He clarifies that the friends were wrong. Job had not caused his own suffering. And what Job shows us, the book of Job, it's in the Bible, is the kind of trust we are to have, that when everything is stripped away, we recognize that God is all we ever really had. God gave us himself, but not necessarily all the details of his plans, not knowing every step of the way. But the book of Job can also be a comfort to us, to know that Satan cannot exceed the limits that God sets. God allowed what happened to Job, but there were limits to this suffering, and God did not cause these events to happen to him. You see, before the fall, there was no suffering. God created a perfect world. He didn't create a sinful world. But when sin entered into the world, so did suffering, persecution, hardship, all the things that we think of a broken world came in. The difficulties in our lives can be a byproduct of a sinful world. Yes, they can be a consequence for our own action. For example, if you break the law, then it's likely that you are going to go to prison. It is likely that you're going to have to go through the journey of what it means to be in prison, physically, mentally, emotionally, financially. Or you know what, if you're a bit relaxed when it comes to speeding and you get caught, you're still going to have the consequences that you might get 3 points on your license, you could get a speeding fine, you might have to pay out money that you didn't have or that was needed for the food for the family. Or what about as a friend, if you lie to your friends? All of a sudden, maybe your friends don't want to be friends with you. They don't trust you. So there are situations where through what we do and through the way we are, there can be a consequence for that. And that can involve suffering and it can involve hardship. But Jesus here in the situation with this blind man, in his response to the disciples' question of who sinned, clearly states that it was not the sin of the parents or the man born blind. Jesus was not saying the parents had never sinned. But that was not the reason why the man was born blind. He left no doubt about this and wanted to correct their theology and understanding. It was not something that this man's parents had done, and it was not something the blind man had done whilst in the womb. Yet the understanding at this time was sickness was a result, a consequence of someone in the family committing a sin. And if the family weren't admitting the sin, they thought, oh, that family must have some secret sin going on. And it would cause the people to distance themselves from them. You see, we live in a fallen world. As we know, where good behaviour, it's not always rewarded. Bad behaviour, not always punished. Therefore, innocent people suffer. But we also live in a world where people have a calmer approach. The idea that a person has good or bad luck as a result of their actions. So because of the sin of the parents, their child was born blind. And I think, just as I was preparing this, that there's people in the room that need to hear this today, that if you are going through a difficult time at the moment, if you are suffering, you may have convinced yourself that God is punishing you, that he loves everyone else, but not you. And you may be sitting here racked with guilt because you think you're going through what you are going through because of sin. But you're thinking, I don't know what I've done wrong. I don't understand why this is happening. I don't think I've done anything to cause this. And obviously, it's always important to ask God if there's things in our hearts that aren't right, if there's things that we've dealt with wrong. But if you know that's not the case, you need to know that these things happen as a result of a fallen world. And do not let this become a wedge between you and God. Do not let it lead to you walking away from God. For what we are about in John 9 is the miracle that awaited the man. This is what we are about to see, the miracle that awaited this man. And Jesus continues his sentence in verse 3, but this happens so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. The healing that was about to be brought about was for God's glory. This man was born blind. He had never seen the faces of those he loved. He'd never seen where he lived. He'd never seen nature. He would have had a really difficult ride, going from a baby as he was learning to walk, move around, bumping his head, maybe cutting himself, doing everything he can to make it easier for himself to get around with being blind. He would have had to rely on hearing to recognize voices, familiar sounds and warnings. And we read later on this passage after the miracle takes place, when the Pharisees ask his parents, what had happened? How was it that he could now see? The parents feared for their own standing in society, that they just say, he's of age, ask him. Because if they were to sort of say, well, that was Jesus who did that, they would have been kicked out of the temple. They'd have lost their relationships, their place in society. But what it also tells us is this person, this man who was born blind, was over the age of 13. By saying that he was of age, it meant that he was above 12 or 13, as that was the age a Jewish boy would have had his coming of age ceremony, a bar mitzvah. So for at least 13 years, if not a lot older, this man was blind. It was all he knew. It was normal to him. His miracle did not come when he was a few weeks old, when he was a few months old, when he was a few years old. He would have needed to bring some income in. So we'll come back to that in a second. But he would have been suffering for a large amount of time, 13 years at least of his suffering of being blind. And he probably came to the place himself where he thought, this is going to be my life. This is the rest of my life. But on that day, Jesus meets him and his life is forever changed. This just starts out as a normal day. It says Jesus came across him, so he could have been out begging on the streets. You know, he would have needed to bring in that wage with being blind. He would have needed some money to be able to support himself and the family. And because of people's theology that we've seen, you know, the parents or the unborn child had sinned, the way people viewed him might not have been great. They might have looked down at him. You know, he was there begging for money to try and get by, always feeling less than everyone else. It would have been tough for him. And from the accounts following this, it seems that this man didn't really know who Jesus was. He says when asked he might be a prophet, that it was a man they called Jesus. You know, he might have heard people talking about Jesus. He may have heard the miracles about the casting out of demons, the raising of the dead. But here, Jesus encounters the blind man and he comes to know who Jesus is. So Jesus spits on the ground, makes some mud with his saliva and puts it on the man's eyes. And I think sometimes we just read that and be like, yeah, okay. Jesus spits on the mud, gets that mud and puts it on the man's eyes. Yeah, no problem. The blind man would have only heard what was happening. He might have heard Jesus spitting onto the ground thinking, what is going on here? And if you came across this in the street, if you saw someone who was blind and someone spitting in mud and putting it on his eyes, you would be like, that is cruel. You would probably even might go up and be like, what do you think you're doing? He can't see. Why are you doing that to this person? But Jesus does this and then says, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And it actually means sent. Jesus was sending this man to go and wash. So I want us to get this picture, a blind man. He's got mud mixed with a stranger's saliva on his eyes by someone who he doesn't seem to know really who he is, and is told to walk about a quarter of a mile. It wasn't just on the next street, it was a quarter of a mile walk to the place where he was to wash. And he can't see this man. He can only hear what is happening, and the command is to go and wash. Why? Why did Jesus not just heal him there? We read of all that Jesus did. He healed people right there before him. He got people, he said, get up and walk. He cast out demons and left them trembling before him. He provided food for 500 people from a boys' picnic. He raised the dead. So why, with this man, did he put mud on his eyes and send him for a walk to wash? Put yourselves in that man's shoes. All he had known was blindness. And now he's in this situation. He was going on a journey to wash because he'd been told to. Or on his journey to the pool, I wonder what was going through his head. What am I doing? I'm walking to a pool with someone's spit and mud on my eyes because they've told me to do it. Is this going to bring about my healing? It might not work for me. It'd probably work for someone else. I don't want to get my hopes up. I don't want to be disappointed. What would he be, excited? This is my moment. I'm finally going to be healed from this, from being blind for over 13 years. So after his 1/4 mile walk, he arrives at the pool, he washes, and as he washes, he begins to see. John says he comes home seeing. Now, I remember when I was in school and I started noticing that I couldn't read the board. And so if I had to copy off the board, I'd be like having to look over at my friends to like write down what was on the board because I couldn't see it. And I remember my teacher one day saying, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I can't see the board." And they said, "Just go and get your eyes tested." But at that time, I was like, I don't want glasses. I don't want to have to wear glasses. That was back ages ago. And got my eyes tested, needed glasses. And I remember coming home and I remember standing in the kitchen and I looked out the window and I put glasses on and I was like, wow, I can see detail because I can't see far away, and I could see like leaves, I could see lines in leaves which I'd never been able to see before. All this stuff that I'd missed out on, but I could still see, but it was just not detail. I can't imagine what it must have been like for this man to have never seen, that it was just normal to see nothing before you, to dream, but not with images, because there was never any images that he would have seen. And now here he is, for the first time, being able to see the faces of those he loved, being able to see nature, being able to see what eyes actually were. His miracle had come. And following this miracle in chapter 9, we read 4 occasions when the same question is asked. How did this man receive sight? How did he receive his sight? Just to say, it wasn't the mud. It was not some holy mud that they had back then that they put on eyes and they were able to see. It wasn't Jesus' spit that was in the mud. It wasn't that Jesus' spit had some sort of something about it which made eyes being able to see. How did this man receive his sight? He held on to Jesus' words. He was obedient to what Jesus had asked him to do. He did not just encounter Jesus. He did what Jesus asked him to do. And it was not until he held on to Jesus' words and did what Jesus asked him to do that he received his sight. If he had refused to walk the 1/4 mile to the pool and wash it off, I doubt we'd be reading about him today. That's what it is to follow Jesus, to hold on to his words and obey them. The blind man had been like that all his life. But when Jesus spoke, the man did as was asked of him. The man didn't know what was going to happen when he went and washed. Was it going to work? But he did it anyway. Jesus didn't have a formula for how he healed people. And I think sometimes we can look for a formula and think, well, if I just say those exact same words in that exact same position, then that person's going to be healed. But Jesus didn't have a formula. If this man was waiting on a formula, then he probably would have been disappointed when Jesus put mud on his eyes, because he would have been thinking, he's not done this to anybody else. Why has he done it to me? Why didn't he just speak and I could have been able to see? You see, in all situations, we're called to follow. But I'm speaking today into the pain you may be suffering right now. The hardship, the challenges that you are facing right now. And that is what God says. Hold on to my words. Hold on to my promises. For at least 13 years, this man was blind, but his miracle came. It wasn't in an instant. It was on a journey. We are called to hold on to his word, even when it feels like the situation's not changing. Even when it feels like the situation is getting worse, when it feels uncomfortable, confusion, a longer route through the wilderness. What is Jesus saying to you and to your situation? Hold on to it. What has God promised you? It's in the Bible. You can probably Google promises of God. Hold on to those promises. Don't turn away. Don't give up. Hold on until you see your miracle. Miracles can come in an instant. And this morning your miracle may come, but they can also come after years and years. But don't give up. Don't give up on your journey. Don't give in to the lies that tell you you are not good enough for the miracle, that you are not loved, that you are not trying hard enough. No. Take hold of Jesus' words and do them. And carry on doing them regardless of the circumstances that you face. The blind man on his way to the pool, he couldn't see ahead. He was uncomfortable, unsure, and all he could do was take one step at a time, holding on to the words of Jesus to go and wash. So to summarize, what does this sign reveal about God? God brings glory to himself through our suffering. In the prayer meeting today, Jan, she gave me permission to share. She shared about last week. Her eyes were really bad. They were really uncomfortable, and she came forward for prayer, and God has healed her eyes. And this is an example of, through her suffering, of her eyes being uncomfortable, of, struggling to see properly, God brought glory to himself through that. And that's what I mean by God brings glory to himself through our suffering. Secondly, what does this sign reveal about God? God speaks to us. He doesn't use the same methods or formula. He uses his ways to accomplish his purposes. Third, God knows us. He responds to us personally, and he knows what will bring about the miracle in our own lives. He cares about our growth, our journey, and he wants us to trust him with one step at a time, holding on to his word. So what does this mean for us? 1, spend time with God. Learn to hear his voice. Hold on to his word, his promises, and even if the situation gets worse, goes down a route where you don't understand it, hold on to his word. Choose to trust him. His timing is his ways. And finally, do as he says. If he tells you to do something, do it. For going back, why John wrote this book, I have written these words so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That by believing you may have life in his name, fullness of life. It's holding on to his word, holding on to what he says. Let's just pray. We hope that you've been blessed by this message. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at www.kingschurchwirral.co.uk.